The first days in the new neighborhood felt calm, almost too calm, kind of quiet that made the homeowner think they had finally found a place where life would slow down a little. After years of renting small apartments and moving from one place to another, settling into a proper house felt like a fresh start. The street was lined with tall trees, the kind that moved gently in the wind. And on early mornings, birds would gather on the fences, as if welcoming the new day. For the first week, nothing unusual happened. The homeowner unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, cleaned the garage, and tried to make the house feel like home. Neighbors walked their dogs, kids played on the sidewalks, and everything seemed peaceful. It felt like the right decision, something that would finally bring stability. But small signs of trouble started showing earlier than expected. It began with a simple note placed on the front door. The handwriting was stiff and formal. The message said the lawn seemed slightly uneven and should be trimmed according to community standards. The homeowner read it twice, confused. The grass had barely grown since moving in. Still wanting to be a respectful neighbor, they pulled out the lawnmower that same evening and tidied the yard. A day later, another message appeared, this time in the mailbox. The complaint was about a small plant pot placed near the front steps. It was a simple clay pot with a green plant that belonged to the homeowner for years, something harmless. But the note said it was out of compliance. The words felt heavy and unnecessary, but the homeowner shrugged it off. Maybe this neighborhood was just strict. Maybe this was normal. When the homeowner asked a friendly-looking neighbor about it, the neighbor's eyes shifted around nervously. They spoke softly, as if worried someone else might hear. They said the HOA here was known for being a little over the top. Nothing major, just very involved in everything. The neighbor gave a weak smile, the kind that tried to be polite but carried a warning underneath. The homeowner thanked them and went back inside, feeling a strange mix of confusion and concern. Another week passed. The tone of the notices felt more personal. One morning, a third message appeared, this time taped to the garage door. It said the car had been parked a few inches too close to the left side of the driveway. The homeowner stared at the driveway lines. It was almost impossible to tell what difference a few inches could make. It all felt unnecessary. Still not wanting to cause any trouble, the car was adjusted, but it didn't stop. A small misunderstanding turned into a pattern of constant messages. A new notice came for a decoration hung near the front window. Another came because a trash can was rolled out too early before pickup. The homeowner felt like they were living under a microscope. Every tiny thing became a reason for the HOA to reach out. The most unsettling part wasn't the messages themselves, but the feeling that someone was watching closely. The notices were too specific, too detail-oriented. Someone had to be paying attention at unusual times. Late in the evening, while walking to the mailbox, the homeowner caught a glimpse of a person standing at the corner of the street, holding a phone and pointing it toward the house. When they noticed the homeowner watching, they quickly turned away and pretended to be looking at something else. At first, the homeowner tried to ignore it. Maybe this person was just out for a walk, or maybe they were texting someone. But something about the posture, the way they froze for a moment, made the homeowner uncomfortable. They went inside and locked the door, telling themselves not to overthink the situation. The pattern continued. Every small detail turned into an issue. A small garden tool left leaning against the side wall. Package left on the porch too long, even a wind chime that made a gentle sound when the breeze picked up. Each notice felt colder than the last. The writing style in the messages didn't change, but the tone behind them did. What started off sounding like formal reminders now felt like someone was trying to pick a fight. The homeowner tried to handle everything calmly. They stayed polite. They followed the rules as best as they could. After all, a quiet life was all they wanted. But no matter how much they tried to keep things peaceful, the complaints kept coming. It felt like someone in the HOA wasn't trying to maintain neighborhood standards. They were trying to target a specific person. One afternoon, while the homeowner was cleaning the front walkway, a car pulled up slowly to the curb. A woman stepped out, holding a clipboard and wearing a firm expression that didn't match her friendly clothes. She introduced herself as a member of the HOA board. Her voice was steady, not rude, but not warm either. She began pointing out small things around the yard that supposedly needed attention. A leaf pile here. A small crack in the driveway there. Even the shape of the mailbox. Everything in her eyes needed improvement. The homeowner listened quietly, answering with short nods and polite words, not wanting to cause conflict. But inside, a feeling grew that this wasn't normal. The list of concerns kept growing, and the woman's tone made it seem like these issues were intentional, as if the homeowner was doing something wrong on purpose. When she left, she gave a tight smile that carried more judgment than friendliness. The homeowner watched her drive away, realizing this wasn't just strictness. This was something else, something personal. Later that evening, while sitting at the dinner table, the homeowner felt a strange heaviness. Moving here was supposed to be a step toward peace, not stress. They thought about their old neighborhood, about the people who smiled easily and mind their own business. Here, it felt like someone was waiting for them to slip up. A few days passed without incident. No notices. No visits. For a moment it seemed like things were improving. The homeowner tried to relax, telling themselves maybe the worst was over. Maybe it was just a rough start. Maybe the HOA had finally realized the complaints were unnecessary. But the calm didn't last. One morning, the homeowner walked outside to find another notice stuck to the porch railing. This one was longer than the others. It listed 5 separate issues, each more trivial than the last. At the bottom, it warned that repeated violations could lead to fines. The words felt heavy. A fine? For what? A misplaced plant? A slightly uneven lawn? A tool leaning on the wall? The homeowner stood still for a long moment, holding the paper, trying to understand what they were being dragged into. Something about the way the notice was written felt sharp, almost threatening. It wasn't about community rules. It was about control. Later in the afternoon, the neighbor who had spoken quietly before was out walking their dog. They paused near the sidewalk and looked around carefully before speaking. Their voice was low again, almost whispering. They said they had seen the same HOA member taking pictures of the homeowner's house earlier that morning, not far away, not discreetly. Almost proudly, the homeowner felt a cold chill run down their back. So it wasn't just notices. Someone was intentionally looking for things to complain about. Someone wanted to stir trouble. Days continued like this, each one carrying a hint of tension. The homeowner tried to stay patient. They didn't shout, didn't fight, didn't argue. They kept fixing every small thing the HOA complained about. But the notices didn't slow down. In fact, the more the homeowner cooperated, the more the HOA seemed to push. It felt like an invisible battle one the homeowner never wanted to be part of. One evening, the sun was setting, and the sky was painted in a soft orange light. The homeowner sat on the front steps, thinking about everything, wondering how such small things had turned into something so stressful. They didn't know yet that this was only the beginning. The real trouble hadn't even started, but deep down, they felt it. Something was building. Something was coming. And the strange behavior of the HOA was only a sign of what was about to unfold next. The peaceful home they hoped for was slowly becoming a place filled with uncertainty. And though they didn't know it yet, the events ahead would test not only their patience, but their sense of safety in ways they never imagined. From the outside, the neighborhood still looked peaceful, but for the homeowner, the quiet had turned into something tense. Every time they stepped outside, they felt the weight of eyes on them. It wasn't just in their imagination anymore. Too many small signs pointed in the same direction. And even when nothing happened on a particular day, the silence carried an uneasy feeling, like someone was waiting for the next chance to act. The first time they truly sensed the change was when they noticed the same HOA board member walking past the house several times in one afternoon. She wasn't pretending to take a walk or greet neighbors. She carried the same clipboard from before, and each time she passed, her eyes scanned the yard with unnecessary detail. She didn't stop to wave or talk. She just walked slowly, stared too long, then kept going. At first, the homeowner tried to ignore it. They told themselves she was just doing her job. Maybe she had new responsibilities. Maybe she was checking every house, not just theirs. But when she passed for the third time and paused near the mailbox, Pretending to look at a brochure, the truth became harder to deny. It wasn't routine, it was surveillance. That evening, the homeowner sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, staring at the stack of notices they had saved. They had kept every one of them, even the most unreasonable ones. The pile had grown thicker than they realized. Looking through them again, patterns began to appear, words repeated too often. Accusations made with strange confidence, details too specific to be random. The more they read, the more it became clear someone wasn't just keeping track of mistakes. Someone was looking for them. Still, the homeowner tried to stay patient. They didn't want to jump to conclusions or cause problems. This was their home now, and they wanted peace. But the situation was becoming harder to understand. The next morning, the homeowner heard a soft knock on the door. It wasn't loud or urgent, just a light tapping. When they opened the door, a middle-aged man stood there, holding a small stack of mail that the wind must have blown out of the box. He smiled politely and said he found it scattered near the sidewalk. He didn't stay long. But before he left, he leaned closer and lowered his voice. He said he had seen the same HOA member walking around the house the night before after the sun had gone down. She seemed to be taking pictures again. He looked uncomfortable even mentioning it, as if he worried about being overheard. The homeowner thanked him, but the rest of the day felt different. It wasn't just the HOA being strict anymore. It was someone crossing boundaries. Later that afternoon, while the homeowner was sweeping leaves off the driveway, the HOA member appeared again. This time, she didn't pretend to be walking by. She stopped right at the edge of the driveway and watched silently for a moment before speaking. She began with a comment about the driveway looking untidy. Then, she mentioned the garden hose being too visible. Then she pointed out the paint on the porch railing, saying it looked slightly faded and might violate visual standards. The homeowner felt their chest tighten. It wasn't what she said. Every word sounded like it came from someone who wanted to find fault. Someone who had made up their mind long before arriving. The homeowner tried to respond calmly, asking politely where they could find official rules that mentioned these concerns. The woman brushed off the question, insisting that the HOA expected cooperation and attention to detail. Her expression didn't change once. It was like she had already decided the homeowner was a problem. When she finally left, the homeowner took a deep breath and sat on the porch steps. They felt drained. It was only midday, yet they felt like they had lived a full day already. A few hours later, another neighbor approached discreetly. He didn't stay long, but he said something that made the homeowner's heart drop. He explained that the HOA member had a history of picking out certain residents to monitor closely. Anyone who didn't match her idea of perfect compliance became a target. Sometimes it lasted a few weeks. Sometimes months. The homeowner asked quietly if there was a reason for her targeting specific people. The neighbor shrugged and said nobody knew. Some believed she just liked control. Others thought she enjoyed feeling important. Whatever the reason, everyone agreed on one thing. Once she set her sights on someone, she didn't back off easily. Hearing this didn't make the homeowner feel better. It only added to the stress. They wondered if they should reach out to the HOA officially, maybe report the behavior. But then they remembered the cold smile the woman gave them earlier, the way she walked around as if she owned the street. If she already had influence, complaining might only make things worse. The next few days were filled with more strange encounters. The same HOA member walked by at unusual times. Early mornings. Late evenings. Sometimes she paused near the yard, looking at the grass or the garden like she was hunting for reasons to complain. One day, the homeowner went outside to find her crouched near the side of the house. When she noticed they were watching, she stood up quickly and pretended to be checking something on her phone. But her shoes were covered in dirt, and her expression was tense. The homeowner asked if everything was all right. The woman only nodded and walked away fast without answering. That night, the homeowner decided it was time to take their own precautions. They installed a small camera near the front door and another near the side wall. Nothing extreme, just enough to record if someone trespassed again. They weren't doing anything wrong. They wanted proof in case things went too far. The following morning, the homeowner reviewed the footage out of curiosity. Their stomach tightened when they noticed movement at around midnight. A figure walked near the front porch slowly, carefully, trying not to make noise. They couldn't see the face clearly, but the posture and the way they carried themselves looked familiar. It was the same HOA member. The homeowner felt a mix of anger and fear. They weren't imagining it. Someone was crossing personal boundaries without hesitation. The next day, another notice arrived. This one was different. It didn't list a single issue. Instead, it said the homeowner had been uncooperative with previous reminders. The tone felt disapproving, almost accusatory, as if the homeowner had been ignoring the HOA completely. But they hadn't ignored anything. They fixed every small thing. They followed every instruction. They did everything to avoid conflict. This notice wasn't about rules. It was about pressure. Feeling overwhelmed, the homeowner decided to speak directly to the HOA office. They planned to stay calm, explain everything, ask for clarity, and request that the excessive monitoring stop. When they arrived, the office lobby was quiet. A receptionist greeted them politely and offered a seat. The homeowner explained the situation carefully, mentioning the constant notices, the observations at odd hours, and the feeling of being watched too closely. The receptionist listened with a neutral expression, nodding slowly. After a moment, she said she would bring out someone from the board. The person who stepped out wasn't the woman who had been monitoring the homeowner. Instead, it was an older gentleman. He shook hands kindly and asked the homeowner to explain everything again. His tone was calm, almost too calm, like someone trying to understand, but not yet convinced. After hearing the full explanation, he sighed softly and said the HOA expected all residents to follow community rules, but he would look into the situation. Something about his answer felt rehearsed. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer solutions. The homeowner left the office feeling the same weight as before, maybe even heavier. It felt like speaking up had changed nothing. As the days continued, the HOA member's behavior grew more unusual. She no longer tried to hide her surveillance. She walked right up to the property line and stared at the yard for long moments, tapping her pen against her clipboard. Sometimes she wrote something down. Sometimes she just watched. One evening, the homeowner was sitting on the porch trying to relax. She approached yet again. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate. When she reached the walkway, she asked a question that felt almost scripted. She wanted to know why the homeowner had visited the HOA office. Her tone carried a sharp edge, the kind that hid irritation behind a polite smile. The homeowner answered calmly, explaining they only wanted clarity and fairness. But the woman's smile tightened. She nodded slowly, then turned and walked away without another word. The moment she left, the homeowner felt a cold knot form in their stomach. Something had shifted. Her visits weren't just frequent, they were personal. As night fell, the homeowner sat quietly, thinking about everything that had happened since the first notice. What started as simple reminders had turned into targeted attention, and that attention had become something even more concerning. The pressure wasn't slowing down. It was building. Every day felt like walking on thin ice. Waiting for the next unreasonable complaint or unexpected visit, the homeowner didn't know it yet. But the tension was reaching a point where something bigger, something far more serious was about to unfold. The small issues, the monitoring, the notices, they were all leading toward a moment that would reveal exactly how far the HOA was willing to go, and that moment was closer than they realized. The days that followed felt heavier than before. The homeowner tried to stay busy with normal routines, hoping it would ease the pressure they had been feeling. They watered the plants, cleaned the house, and even tried going for quiet walks around the block. But no matter what they did, the sense of being watched didn't fade. It had settled deeply into their daily life. It's like a shadow they couldn't shake. The HOA members' visits became more predictable in a way that felt unsettling. She showed up early in the mornings when the air was still cool, walking slowly, scanning every inch of the homeowner's property. Then she would return again in the late afternoon, tapping her pen against her clipboard while staring at the yard with a look that felt like disapproval. The homeowner tried not to react. not wanting to give her any reason to escalate things. They kept conversations polite and short, but each encounter left them more uneasy. One late afternoon, the homeowner noticed her pacing along the street across from the house. She wasn't pretending to be on her phone or checking anything. She stood still, watching the porch, the windows, the front yard. When she saw the homeowner glance her way, she didn't look away. She simply raised her chin slightly, as if she wanted them to know she was watching. It was the first time her behavior felt openly confrontational that night. The wind blew softly through the trees, and the house felt quiet. Too quiet. The homeowner sat by the living room window, trying to think of ways to calm their mind. They thought about reaching out to a friend, maybe inviting someone over, but the stress of everything made them hesitate. They didn't want anyone else dragged into the situation. Instead, they reviewed the camera footage again. The past few nights showed nothing unusual, just passing cars, porch lights turning on and off, and the occasional jogger. But on the fourth night in the footage, something stood out. At around 11 p.m., the same HOA member appeared again. She walked slowly along the sidewalk, stopping directly in front of the homeowner's driveway. She turned toward the house and stood there for nearly a minute. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't knock. She just stared. Then she scribbled something on her clipboard before walking away. The homeowner felt a tight knot in their stomach. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was about control. The next morning, as expected, another notice arrived. This one accused the homeowner of leaving a garden tool visible to the street overnight. The homeowner stared at the paper, realizing it was referring to a small rake that had accidentally been left leaning against the wall near the backyard gate, something the camera had caught her staring. It felt too deliberate. The homeowner decided they couldn't let this continue. Without some response, they drafted a polite letter asking for calm, fairness, and a review of the rules being enforced. They placed a copy in the HOA mailbox and another in the office drop box. They hoped it would open a reasonable will-slow conversation. But the following day, the situation took a sharp turn. In the late afternoon, while the homeowner was sitting on the porch scrolling through their phone, the HOA member walked directly toward them. Her footsteps were firm, her expression tight, without greeting. She accused the homeowner of being difficult and ignoring repeated warnings. Her tone was sharp, almost angry, as if she had been waiting for a chance to confront them. The homeowner kept calm, explaining they had followed every rule and had even written a letter asking for clarity. But she cut them off, insisting she knew what she had seen and that the homeowner was making things harder for themselves. Her voice rose just enough for the words to carry across the street. The homeowner felt their hands shake slightly, but stayed polite. They didn't want to argue. They didn't want to give her any reason to escalate. When she realized she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted, she stepped closer and said in a colder tone, "You need to learn how things work here." Then she turned and walked away without another word. The homeowner sat frozen for a moment, playing the words in their head. It didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a threat. That night, long after the sun had gone down, the homeowner was in bed trying to sleep when they heard a noise outside. A faint crunch of gravel. Soft footsteps. The sound of someone lingering. Their heart raced. They reached for their phone and opened the camera. There she was again, standing near the side of the yard. She seemed to be looking closely at something near the fence. Then she stepped onto the grass, just a little, barely past the property line, but enough to make the homeowner's breath catch. She took a few pictures with her phone, glanced toward the house, then hurried away. The homeowner stared at the screen, stunned. This was trespassing. This was harassment. This was no longer something they could fix by mowing the lawn or moving a plant by morning. The tension had grown too strong to ignore. The homeowner knew they needed real help now. They considered calling the police, but they weren't sure how to explain everything. They didn't want to seem dramatic or cause unnecessary trouble. They just wanted the harassment to stop, but they didn't have much time to think. Around noon, The homeowner was cleaning up the garage when they heard a sharp knock on the door. It wasn't a neighborly knock. It was loud, quick, impatient. When the homeowner opened the door, the HOA member was standing there, breathing hard as if she had hurried over. She was angry. She asked why the homeowner had been spying on her and recording her without permission. Her words rushed out quickly, filled with accusation. The homeowner tried to explain the cameras were for security and recorded everyone equally. They had never targeted her specifically, but she didn't want explanations. Her voice grew louder. Her hands moved in fast gestures. She stepped forward, too close, making the homeowner instinctively take a step back. A couple of neighbors turned their heads toward the scene. The HOA member noticed them watching and immediately shifted her tone. She pretended to be calmer, but her words were still sharp. She said the homeowner was creating problems and refusing to cooperate. The homeowner tried to de-escalate, saying they didn't want conflict, that they only wanted fairness. But it didn't matter. The HOA member suddenly pulled out her phone and, without hesitation, dialed 911. The homeowner froze. She began telling the dispatcher that the homeowner was acting aggressive, refusing to let her leave and making her feel threatened. None of it was true. Homeowner felt shock ripple through their body. For a moment, they couldn't move. They tried to speak, but their voice felt stuck. Neighbors watched with wide eyes, some whispering to each other. The HOA member kept her voice shaky and dramatic for the call, making it sound like she was in danger. She even stepped back a few steps. Pretending to be scared, the homeowner finally found their voice and calmly said she was lying. But she ignored them, continuing her story. When she hung up, she glared at the homeowner and muttered, "This is what happens when you don't listen." Then she walked away quickly, leaving the homeowner standing there in disbelief. The street felt silent. Too silent, the homeowner's heart pounded. They felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the fear of what would happen next. They hadn't done anything wrong. They hadn't raised their voice. They hadn't touched her. But she had twisted everything into something dangerous. Within minutes, the faint sound of sirens approached. The homeowner stood frozen on the porch, unsure of what to do. They considered going inside, but worried that might make things look worse. They considered waiting on the sidewalk, but didn't want to appear confrontational. So they stayed still. The sirens grew louder. Then 2 police cars pulled up quietly, not rushing in, but moving with calm professionalism. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions neutral but alert. The homeowner's heart hammered as they approached. They didn't know it yet, but the next few minutes would determine everything, whether the truth would come out or whether the situation would spiral into something far worse. The stage was set. The HOA member had made her move, and now the police would decide what happened next. It was only a few days after the strange 911 incident when the air around the neighborhood began to feel different for the resident. The streets looked the same. The houses stood in their usual quiet lines. The lawns remained freshly cut, and the same morning dog walkers strolled by. But something deeper had shifted. The resident could feel it every time they stepped outside. It was like the world around them had paused, watching, whispering, waiting for something to unfold. Even though the police had left with calm words and no action taken against the resident, the moment still lingered heavily in the air. Anyone who saw the patrol cars that day had formed their own opinions, even if they never said a word. And that was the challenging part. People didn't need to talk openly to send messages. A longer pause when passing the driveway, a smaller smile than usual, or an avoided wave said enough. But among all the uneasy feelings, the resident also sensed something new, something small but important. A few quiet looks from neighbors no longer carried judgment, but sympathy. A few nodded in understanding. People weren't blind. They saw what the HOA had been doing, even if most were too afraid to stand up publicly. The resident felt that shift and held on to it like a thin rope of hope. Still, the HOA wasn't finished. That was clear the next morning. The resident heard a car door slam outside, followed by hurried footsteps. When they peeked through the window, They saw the same HOA board member pacing around with a clipboard, talking loudly on the phone. Every few steps, the board member stopped to point at the resident's house, as if giving a dramatic speech to someone on the other end. The residents sighed quietly, out, rubbed their forehead, and stepped outside. As soon as they did, the HOA member spun around with an expression that looked ready for battle. "You're going to have to fix this immediately," they snapped. "Fix what?" the resident asked calmly. "Your exterior lighting is out of compliance, and your hedge is uneven. And you left your trash bins too close to the curb after pickup?" The resident blinked slowly. The trash bins had been brought in an hour after pickup. The hedge was trimmed last week, and the outdoor lights hadn't been touched in months. "What exactly is out of compliance?" the resident asked. "It's all written here." The HOA member shook the clipboard like evidence. The resident didn't argue. They knew too well by now that arguing only fueled the board member. Instead, they said, "If you want to leave a written notice, that's fine. I'll review it." That calm answer irritated the HOA member even more. "This is unacceptable behavior," the board member announced loudly, glancing at a neighbor who happened to be walking by. The resident felt a flare of exhaustion, but stayed composed. "I'm not behaving in any way. I'm just asking for clarity. You're being confrontational." "I'm not," the resident said softly. "You're raising your voice." "I'm not raising my voice," the resident replied. Still speaking gently, it was unfolding again, the same pattern the resident had seen a dozen times. The HOA member tried to provoke, then twist the situation into a complaint. But the resident wasn't giving them anything. The board member finally left after snapping a few unnecessary photos of the driveway. Later that afternoon, the resident received a letter taped onto their door. It was a formal warning, full of accusations that had no evidence behind them. The resident kept it, just like they kept every notice, every picture, every voicemail. They were building a collection, not to fight the HOA, but to protect themselves. The following week, more things happened. Not big things, just constant irritating, unnecessary things. A new complaint arrived saying the resident's car looked unregistered, even though the tags were up too. Date, then another one saying the backyard fence was too old, even though it was the same fence every other house on the block had. Another notice said the resident had hosted a loud gathering, but the resident had been home alone. That entire evening, none of it made sense. It was almost laughable if it wasn't so emotionally draining. But the residents stayed calm. That was the only thing that protected them. One night, while putting away recycling, the resident noticed a neighbor across the street standing by their mailbox. The neighbor hesitated, then walked over. "Hey," they said softly. I saw what happened the other day with the police." The resident nodded politely. "That wasn't right," the neighbor continued. "You didn't do anything? Everyone could see that. I just wanted you to know you're not alone. The HOA has been going after people like this for a long time." The resident felt warmth in their chest. Not joy, but relief. "Someone finally said it. Thanks," the resident replied. "It's been a lot." The neighbor nodded again. "They're hoping you'll mess up." "But I don't think you will." The resident offered a tired smile. "I'm trying not to." As the neighbor walked away, the resident stood there for a moment, letting the night breeze carry away some of the heaviness. Still, not everything was getting better. A few days later, while the resident was inside preparing dinner, there was a loud banging on the front door. Not knocking, banging. The resident opened the door to find the HOA member again, red-faced and breathing heavily. "We have a serious problem," they said sharply. "What problem?" "Your security camera is pointed toward the sidewalk. That violates privacy rules." "It's pointing at my driveway," the resident replied. "It's also capturing community space. It's capturing the area where people walk by my home," the resident explained calmly. "That's allowed. It's for safety." The HOA member crossed their arms. "I need to inspect it." "No," the resident said. "You don't have permission to come onto my property." That was when the HOA member stepped back dramatically and began speaking loudly, as if performing for invisible witnesses. "This is harassment," the board member shouted. "You're refusing to comply. This is becoming a dangerous situation." The resident stared in disbelief. "Nothing dangerous is happening. You're raising your voice." Again, the HOA member barked. The resident was barely speaking above normal conversation level. "I'm going to have to report this," the HOA member said. The resident stayed silent. There was nothing else to say. When the HOA member stormed off, the resident closed the door and leaned against it. Their hands were shaken, not from fear, but from frustration. It was getting out of control. And deep down, the resident knew where it was heading. Another false emergency call, and this time, the resident worried the HOA member would push even harder. The next day felt unusually tense. People walked by the house more often than usual, as if curious about something. Cars slowed down near the driveway. Even birds seemed quieter. By evening, the resident was sitting on the couch, exhausted from the constant mental strain. That was when bright lights flashed across the window. Police cars again. The resident felt their stomach drop. Not because they were guilty. They had done nothing, but because they already knew what this meant. The HOA member had tried to use 911 against them again. Except this time, the police weren't arriving with concern. They were arriving with suspicion. Not toward the resident, but toward the HOA member. And for the first time, the situation began to turn. The resident stood up, took a deep breath, and walked toward the door, ready to face whatever came next, but this time, not alone. And not without the truth on their side. The moment the police cars pulled up for the second time, the resident felt something shift inside them. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even confusion. It was a quiet, steady sense of tiredness mixed with something stronger, resolve. This had gone on long enough, and whatever was about to happen next, they were ready for it. 2 officers stepped out of the first car, the same pair who had responded during the previous incident. Their faces looked calmer this time, not rushed, not alarmed. The way they walked toward the house already told the resident that the situation was different. No one had their hand near a holster. No one looked tense. There was no calling out commands. The resident opened the door before the officers could. "Knock." "Evening," one officer said gently. "Good. Evening," the resident replied. The officer let out a slow breath, almost like he wished he didn't have to be there. "We received another call about a disturbance here. But before we go any further, I want you to know we're aware of the history." The resident nodded. "I assumed as much. Is everything calm here now?" the officer asked. "Yes," the resident said simply. "It has been calm all day." The second officer glanced around the quiet living room behind them. "It looks calm to me." They exchanged a look with each other, a look that spoke louder than words. The first officer stepped back slightly. "We're going to talk to the person who made the report." The resident didn't need to ask who it was. The HOA board member was already outside at the end of the walkway, waving their arms dramatically as if performing for an audience. "There," the board member shouted when the officers approached. "You see? They're refusing to cooperate again. This is becoming dangerous. I don't feel safe." The officers didn't react. They didn't look alarmed. They didn't even look confused. They simply looked. Tired, the resident watched from the doorway as the officers approached the HOA member. "Can you tell us exactly what happened?" one officer asked. The HOA member launched into a dramatic story, filled with shaky breathing and exaggerated motions. They claimed the resident had been yelling, threatening, behaving aggressively. But the officers didn't take notes this time. They didn't interrupt. They just listened with expressions that slowly grew flatter and flatter. At one point, the board member said, "I was so scared for my safety that I had no choice but to call 911. The second officer finally lifted a hand to pause the performance. "Did you record any of this? Or is there any witness?" "Well, no," the board member stuttered. "I didn't have time because last time," the officer said gently. "We reviewed surveillance from the resident's property. It showed no aggression or threats." The board member blinked rapidly. "Well, Maybe this time the camera didn't catch it. The officer raised an eyebrow. You're saying there was a scene outside the home loud enough to be threatening, but somehow it wasn't loud enough for neighbors to hear or cameras to capture? The HOA member's face stiffened. Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Officers exchanged another glance, the kind of look that said they'd heard enough. Please wait here, the first officer said. They walked back toward the resident. Would you be willing to show us your exterior footage again? The officer asked. Of course, the resident replied. They pulled up the footage on their phone. The officers watched quietly. There was nothing but silence. A few passing cars, a couple of neighbors on a walk, birds, wind, but no yelling. No threats. No confrontation. The officer let out a slow, heavy sigh. Thank you, he said. This is very helpful. The two officers stepped away to speak privately for a moment. The HOA member stood at the end of the driveway, watching nervously, tapping their foot. Finally, the officers returned to them. Sir? The officer said firmly. Misusing 911 is a serious issue. The HOA member blinked. I don't understand. Emergency services are for emergencies, the officer continued. Not personal disputes, not HOA rule disagreements, and not attempts to intimidate someone. I wasn't intimidating anyone. The board member snapped. The second officer kept their tone calm. We have reviewed footage from multiple incidents now, and every time, the resident is calm, compliant, and respectful. That's not true. The HOA member protested. The officer crossed his arms. We just watched the footage. There is no evidence of aggression. The board member's voice became shaky. Well, they hide it. They pretend to be calm when you're here. The officer shook his head slowly. That's not how this works. The board member's face twisted with frustration. You're not listening to me? I've listened to you, the officer said. And I've also reviewed the evidence. At this point, we need to warn you formally. Continuing to file false or misleading reports may lead to consequences. The officer continued. This neighborhood needs to be safe for everyone. That includes the resident. If there are legitimate HOA rule issues, they should be addressed through proper channels, not through emergency services. The board member didn't say anything. Their face was turning red. Do you understand? The officer asked. The board member swallowed hard. Yes. The officers gave a polite nod, then returned to the resident. I'm sorry you're dealing with this. The first officer said quietly. I appreciate you taking it. Seriously, the resident replied. If anything like this happens again, the officer added, call us directly, not through 911. We'll make sure it's handled correctly. The resident nodded. Thank you. With that, the officers walked back to their cars and drove away, leaving the street quieter than it had felt in months. For a long moment, the resident stood at the doorway, breathing in the night air. The sky seemed softer somehow, the breeze calmer. Then something unexpected happened. A neighbor from across the street walked over slowly, hands in their pockets. I saw the whole thing, the neighbor said quietly. You handled yourself well. No. The resident nodded, unsure what to say. Look, the neighbor continued. I know most people around here try to stay out of HOA issues, but what's happening to you isn't fair. If you ever need someone to speak on your behalf, I will. The resident felt something warm in their chest. Thank you. That means a lot. Another neighbor stepped outside and waved, then another. It wasn't a parade, and no one made big speeches. But these small gestures carried weight. People were finally showing they cared. The next morning, the resident woke up with a sense of purpose. They gathered every letter from the HOA, every recorded call, every photo, every time-stamped video clip. They assembled it neatly in a binder. This wasn't revenge. This was protection. Later that week, the resident filed a formal complaint with the HOA management company, the one above the board members. They included everything. Every incident, every recording, every false report. A few days later, The management company responded. They wanted a meeting. When the resident arrived, they were surprised to see two representatives, a legal advisor, and three neighbors who had volunteered to speak. The problematic HOA board member was also there. Their face tightened when they saw the resident, but they said nothing. The meeting began calmly. The residents shared their evidence, speaking clearly and respectfully. They explained how everything started, how it escalated, and how it almost became dangerous. The management company reviewed the binder silently. The room grew heavy. Finally, one of the representatives looked up. "This," she said softly, "is unacceptable." She turned to the HOA board member. "You have repeatedly targeted a resident without cause. You misused authority. You misused emergency services. And you created unnecessary conflict within the community." The board member's face went pale. The advisor added, "Effective immediately, you are removed from your position." The resident didn't smile. They didn't cheer. They didn't feel victorious. They just felt relieved. The representative turned to the resident. "On behalf of the management company, we apologize for what you went through. This should never have happened." "Thank you," the resident said quietly. After the meeting, as the resident walked back to their car, two neighbors approached. "You handled that with so much patience," one said. Another added, "Most people would have lost their temper a long time ago, but you stayed calm. That's why the truth came out." The resident smiled gently. "I just didn't want things to get worse." They meant it. Anger had never been their goal. Peace had, in the weeks that followed. The neighborhood truly changed. The HOA became more balanced, more reasonable, more open to communication. Notices were fair. Meetings were respectful. The tension that had once filled the streets slowly faded. Even the weather seemed lighter. For the first time since moving in, the resident felt like they truly lived in a home, not just a house. Sometimes, when they walked outside in the early morning, neighbors waved with warm smiles instead of tight, nervous ones. Life became quiet again, peaceful. One afternoon, while trimming the hedge, the resident paused and looked around the neighborhood. Kids were riding bikes. A couple walked their dog. Someone was grilling in their backyard. Birds chirped from the trees. It felt like the neighborhood had taken a deep breath and finally exhaled. The residents smiled to themselves. They had gone through months of stress, fear, confusion, and frustration, but they never let anger control them. They never gave the HOA member the reaction they wanted. In the end, the truth protected them, and as life moved forward, the resident carried one lesson with them. Sometimes, the strongest response is staying calm. Sometimes the loudest message is spoken with patience. And sometimes, peace isn't won by fighting, but by refusing to fall into the chaos someone else tries to create. The resident looked up at the quiet sky, took a deep, steady breath, and finally felt at home.